Order, order. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi, the chair of the committee. Can I ask committee members to introduce themselves, please?
Mayor Ellis, I'm the MP for Ribble Valley.
Andrew Cooper, Member of Parliament for Mid Cheshire.
Sean Woodcock, MP for Banbury.
Good morning, Andrew Lewin, MP for Welwyn Hatfield.
Sarah Smith, MP for Hindban.
Will Forster, MP for Woking.
Morning, Lee Dillon, MP for Newbury.
Lewis Stocking, MP for Broxbourne.
Agamander, MP for South West Hertfordshire.
Can I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please? Alan.
Alan Renwick. I'm Professor of Democratic Politics and Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London.
Maria Sobolewska, I'm a Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester.
Toby James, Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of East Anglia and Co-Director of the Electoral Integrity Project.
Thank you for joining us this morning. This is the first of our inquiry into modernising elections. I think elections are always in the news, and for us as politicians, we can't get enough of elections. I'm going to ask my colleague Gagan to kick off with the first question.
I'll start with a general question. How healthy would you say democracy is in the UK at the moment? Nice, easy one.
Happy to start. I think obviously work as academics, we often like to spend a lot of time defining democracy. I think democracy involves lots of aspects. So democracy is more than just elections. Democracy requires constitutional rights and constitutional protections. It also, a real democracy, I would say, also involves people being able to have good living standards, having access to healthcare, having access to education. But focusing just on elections, because obviously the inquiry is looking at modernising elections, the Electoral Integrity Project evaluates elections around the world, and we produce kind of rankings and league tables in terms of election quality. And the UK is ranked 24th out of 39 countries in Europe, so in the bottom half of countries in Europe, 53rd out of 150 countries worldwide. So fairly good. Clearly scope for being a lot better. I mean, the areas of strength in elections are the professionalism and independence of electoral officials who you will hear from today. Really strong integrity in terms of processes, results, the counting processes, and so on. But the weaknesses, in brief, cover, according to the indexes, cover many areas. So the electoral system being one of those, a disproportional system in an era of multi-party politics, problems with voter registration, with nearly 7 or 8 million people either missing from the electoral register or not completely registered. Obviously low levels of participation at elections with difficult voter ID laws, and the role of money is also an ongoing challenge in elections as well.
So my specialism is more looking at voters and what voters think. So from the point of view of British voters, I would say we have relatively well-working democracy, but there are increasingly issues and voters are increasingly dissatisfied. And I would mirror what Toby just said, which is the feeling of not getting the choice that you voted for in elections is increasingly present. So we are definitely looking at the breaches of the system and the system not working in terms of translating how the voters voted into who represents them in Parliament. That is a huge issue. But I know this is outside the scope of your committee, so the one that is inside the scope, and again, Toby already mentioned registration, we have one of the hardest systems of registering voters in the world, and this really needs to stop. It is basically such an easy thing to remove. It's basically an administrative obstacle. It is not really needed. There are many countries that show us how it can be done much more easier, and that is the one that I would say, if we were to change one thing, that's the one I would have gone for.
It's a crazy statement to make.
Is it a crazy statement?
I mean, it's very difficult to register to vote in the UK.
It is much more. I said it's much more difficult than in other countries. Yes.
Alan, did you want to?
I agree with everything that has been said, so I shall be...
Which one? Lewis or
with what has been said by my colleagues. So the UK has a very long-standing tradition of democracy and has maintained healthy, free and fair elections, but there are significant difficulties in particularly the electoral aspects of democracy today. So, as Toby and Maria have both said, participation in elections has fallen, satisfaction with the democratic process, particularly, as Maria said, with being able to make a choice that people are happy with, has declined significantly. So that's one point around public concerns with the state of democracy. Secondly, I think we see significant problems in the functioning of aspects of the system, notably, as Toby said, the role of money in politics, which is again a matter of significant public concern, but also misinformation, disinformation in politics, and widespread problems with harassment and intimidation of candidates and others involved in the electoral process. Thirdly, looking around the world, we see significant examples of democracy being undermined, or at least attempts being made to undermine democracy by international actors and also by domestic actors. And I think the resilience of the UK electoral system to those kinds of challenges is something that needs to be thought about very seriously. And then, fourthly, I think there are significant questions around the core of the electoral system. And I'm not someone who has ever taken a strong view on what the electoral system should be. There are advantages and disadvantages with all sorts of different electoral systems. First past the post and proportional systems and other systems all have good arguments in their favour as well as against. But I think we do risk, given the changes in the party system, having an election next time round that is simply indefensible in terms of the degree to which individual candidates in constituencies clearly have the support of their constituents, and also the degree to which the government that is elected has wide support around the country. So I think at the very least we can no longer kind of presume that the case for first past the post is clear, and I think that would merit further investigation.
Some other colleagues I wanted to bring in quickly, Gagan. Sean and then Lee, did you want to come in? No. So Sean and then back to Gagan quickly.
You've all touched on the electoral system. Just briefly, what do you think the government should do in response to the concerns that you've all flagged up?
I think one of the ways in which it makes sense to... it would be a major reform, and when you have major electoral reforms, there's often disagreements, and it can lead to disconsensus. So some of the research the Electoral Integrity Project's done with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy is to think about how you do electoral reform. And the key mechanism for doing that is to do that on a cross-party basis, to have a specified group with a remit to look at options, to explore the evidence, to listen to different perspectives. So a specialised committee, I think, would be the way forward.
And the government's suggested a commission. I mean, would it be something like that, or do you have something else in mind?
So I would add to what Toby has said. I think the cross-party element is very important in process, but also engaging members of the public is absolutely crucial. So there has been a proposal put forward by the APPG on fair elections for a national commission on the electoral system, and as I say, I don't take a view on what the electoral system should be, but I just think this is a debate that we increasingly need to have, and it needs to be a conversation that engages the public, not just those who are directly involved in elections.
Again, back to you, please.
Thank you. The government's election strategy is titled Restoring Trust in Our Democracy, and notwithstanding what you've all just said, does the Representation of the People Bill meet that ambition?
Do you want to start this time? We'll go the other way.
Well, I think it offers many steps that go in the right direction in terms of improving access to voter registration, in terms of clamping down on some aspects of some problematic aspects of the role of money in politics, in terms of taking some measures at least to address harassment and disinformation and misinformation. But in all these areas, I think it could go further. and I would, very much support many of the calls that have been made by many different organisations to go further. So maybe just to take one example from those various different areas, I think in the area of the role of money in politics, so there are some measures in the bill. Clearly there are more measures coming as a result of the Rycroft review, which I think are very welcome. I think there are some areas that still haven't been addressed that are the Rycroft review kind of hints at, but doesn't make recommendations on. So I think it is indefensible that it is possible to donate any amount of money to political causes. Equality is a fundamental principle of democracy, and the idea that someone can donate 10, 15, 20 million pounds, whatever it may be, whether they're living in the UK or not, I just cannot think of any conceivable defence of that position.
How would you expect elections and political parties to be funded? Because I think there's no public appetite for public money to be spent on political parties.
Well, I think so. A number of people have suggested quite a high limit in terms of donations, say around £1 million around donations, at least as a starting point, in order to establish the principle that it should not be free for people to donate just any amount.
Does that apply to entities like unions as well then? Or is it just individuals?
So clearly these sorts of details need to be worked through, and that is a stumbling block that has led to indecision on this matter for a very long time. There are differences between donations by corporate entities that are controlled essentially by one person and entities that bring together many people. And if it is the case that donations through trade unions are done on an opt-in basis, then there is a good case for saying that those are treated differently. If they're done on an opt-out basis, then there is not a case for saying that they should be treated differently, in my view.
Maybe in a spirit of clarity and transparency, I will declare that I was funded by a trade union for my last election, and many of my Labour colleagues on the committee are probably supported by Labour unions as well.
So just picking up on this thought of where the generally well-meaning legislation doesn't go far enough, I will pick as you probably realize, my favorite topic of registration. And this is to do with the enfranchisement, the extension of franchise to the 16 to 17-year-olds. And this is a great example of a missed opportunity. These young voters are one of the least well-registered groups, and this is an area where we have actually made things worse by moving to individual registration, because under the old system of household registration, often these were the kinds of voters who were registered by their parents. So they have had this sudden change in how they registered, but because they are also less likely to know about politics or be interested in politics, they don't quite have the kind of will to go and register themselves, to inform themselves, to vote. So making that part of electorate, marrying extension of franchise with some form of automatic registration of this group, would have been a great opportunity to improve participation in elections. This is not a unreasonable demand, mostly because these voters, unlike the other voters in this country, are basically within this reach of state in such a way that almost no other group of voters is. Okay, so these are predominantly people still in formal education and generally in touch with various other formal systems, because they're not released until they are 18 from all these kind of state-based system. So we could marry registration of these voters with giving them national insurance numbers, for example, or opt for more kind of university Sheffield-style system of prompting schools to get them registered as they go through the relevant point in their lives and relevant point in the school year. And this is the kind of thing that it would have been relatively cheap, relatively easy, and legislation really should have included, but missed an opportunity on that.
Would you not be targeting certain aspects of the electorate differently to others? Because, I'm a Conservative, but there is a historic understanding that maybe younger voters may vote for non-Conservative parties, therefore ineffectual gerrymandering.
How could you say such a thing?
I agree. I think all people should vote whatever.
That's when they're enlightened.
But more seriously, is there not a concern that if you're proactively targeting or auto-enrolling certain aspects of the electorate that may benefit some political parties.
Which is very important to kind of delineate the automatic or automated or assisted, government-assisted registration of voters from the compulsion to vote, right? So these voters will be registered, will be enabled to make the political choice, to inform themselves, to become interested in the campaign, but they still can make a choice not to vote, of course, right? So we are not advocating Australia-style compulsory voting systems. It is just removing a considerable administrative obstacle. You have to remember that to register, not only do you have to go on the website yourself, you have to have your national insurance number to hand. You often then have to have photo ID to vote as well, which I would advocate that the national insurance number should become a form of photo ID as well, although this act also is trying to extend the number of IDs that we can use. But generally speaking, those kinds of voters are being assisted more than other voters because they are more disadvantaged. So they are less likely to have a photo ID of the sort that is accepted, less likely to have a bank card if they are 17 or 16, if the legislation goes through in the current form, and they are much less likely to be able to access that kind of online service and register themselves. So we are only temporarily assisting them. But of course, in the long run, I do advocate that all voters should be somehow assisted or at least prompted by the state to register.
I remain nervous about targeting certain groups over others. In my view, it should be all or nothing, but I'm sure there'll be further discussion on that.
I would share that nervousness, to be honest. Okay. So I think we do need to be very careful of moving to an arrangement where some people have automated registration and other people don't.
We're going to come to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did a study of 159 countries looking at the voter registration system in place, and it shows, I think, as similar to the research that Marie and colleagues have done, it improves both the completeness and the accuracy. So I think there's some discussion in the parliamentary debates, would this compromise accuracy? It would not. It actually stands to improve completeness and accuracy. So it's very much a win-win. I think this assisted and automatic voter registration is therefore a vital move forward, and the bill enables that. What it's missing is a timetable. So there's no detail about when this would be implemented, which data sources would be implemented. And so in practice, what is happening is that a lot of technical decisions will come forward in secondary legislation and then in guidance that will be developed presumably with the Electoral Commission and Association of Electoral Administrators. Now that technical detail is really important. Which groups, who's going to be assisted? And I think that is an opportunity going forward to include other political parties to ask questions, civil society groups, academics, so there is a consensus about how to develop that. One route which other countries have undertaken, for example, is to require a minister each year to report to Parliament to say what progress has been made in terms of implementing automatic or assisted voter registration, and to give some statistics about what has been made, and that makes sure that there is continuous parliamentary scrutiny beyond this Parliament going forward, because assisted and automatic voter registration is not a one-off. You're not going to flick a switch and suddenly this is going to happen. You're going to need to tinker and change the data sources, and so that continuous process and the scrutiny, like we're having today, is really, really important.
And do you think this is a missed opportunity to consolidate electoral law? Because it's obviously a panacea of legislation involved in elections.
Yes. So you have witnesses coming forward later on that will definitely make that point very strongly. But I mean, with the recommendation, I don't know, Toby, if you remember how old it is to merge all the disparate pieces of legislation that we have about this. So it definitely is a missed opportunity here. Yeah.
I agree.
I'm going to move on to some of the bits inside the piece of legislation. The government says it will pilot innovative approaches to voter registration, but as has been alluded to, there's not yet any detail on these. What approaches would you recommend that the government test, and by when?
Toby's the expert on this. I guess I would just maybe say something on the by when, and then Toby can come in. I think it is very important that we're not in a piloting phase at a time when there might be an impression of bias being created by having pilots going on in some places rather than in others. And one concern there, I know you've got someone from one of the boundary commissions coming, but clearly the next boundary review is due to report in 2031, which I think means they will be using the 2029 registers. And if you have pilots having taken place in some constituencies and not others at that time, then that would skew the boundary review, and that would just be unacceptable. So on timing, it is important to finish pilots and roll something out in advance of that.
Yes, I mean, we talk about pilots, I guess it's worth thinking separately about assisted voter registration and automatic voter registration. So assisted voter registration could work very simply. So, for example, when people apply for their passport or renew a passport using the gov.uk portal, then we can build into that process a tick box so that people's details are automatically kind of sent on. Research we've done has focused on passport being one mechanism there, DVLA applications being another, universal credit applications being another. I think the key thing is that these pilots have to happen very quickly, and we don't want those pilots to take place close to a general election. Otherwise, it's going to put a lot of pressure onto the electoral administrators. So I think what we've seen from Wales is those pilots can take place, they can deliver results. We've seen in Australia you can move through a system within 18 months to delivery, but the clock is ticking, and the detail isn't public yet.
Just mindful of time, we've got quite a lot of questions to get through as well.
Do we move on to the next questions then?
Thank you.
Lovely. Hi, so I want to talk about the Rycroft review. Obviously, we got the recommendations at the end of March. If I could start with Toby and Maria first on your view on those recommendations, and then Alan, when I come to yourself, you described astonishing weaknesses in the bill as originally drafted. So do you think that the government's most recent announcements in response to the Rycroft review tighten that bill as well?
I'll be relatively brief. I welcome the review. I think it really does an important job in terms of focusing our attention on the prospect of foreign interference. That is a major threat that is facing democracies around the world. I guess one thing I'd just like to draw attention to is, again, the electoral register in this, because this is missed. We currently have the open register which is sold to anybody, anywhere around the world for any purpose, and that's not monitored. The representation of the people, the bill proposes to amend that, so it's going to be opt-in. However, it is a bizarre situation for us to sell the details of the public to anyone for any purpose, because that would allow them to be micro-targeted, for the data could be mixed with other bits of data that's available on the dark web. So that is something that's missing, I think, from this conversation. I would strongly urge the committee to move to abolish the editors or open register.
I mostly just agree, and I do think one of the, from the perspective of voters, one of the really important jobs for this particular bill is to try to ensure that the processes are fair and equal for everyone. And I think that kind of security concern and the case of funding that Alan raised, that is something that really chimes up with voters, and so that these are very important areas.
Yeah, and I think the Rycroft recommendations should be implemented in full, in my view, and particularly recommendations on corporate donations, that cap should apply to profits, not revenues, and that it should apply to the total donation from a company over a year rather than to any individual entity. I think these are absolutely vital.
And then I think just, are there any other changes? So, Alan, you just said some there, but are there any other changes to the political finance framework that anyone would recommend? So on top of Rycroft's 17 recommendations? No, okay.
I mean, I made the point earlier about donation caps, and I think also looking at controls over spending that don't just cover the campaign periods, but cover, we know a huge amount of activity now takes place throughout the electoral cycle. So looking again at those spending controls seems
I
important.
think actually the regulated period changes or forces a change in behaviour, because you'll see a ramp up until you hit the regulated period and then a drop back down to be within regulated spend, don't you? So, thanks.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. I want to take us back to votes to 16 and automated voter registration and how the two need to work effectively together. Look, I'm a supporter of votes at 16. It's already in place in Scotland and Wales for devolved elections. I don't see any reason why voters in England and Northern Ireland shouldn't have that same right. But I am really interested in your expert view on how this interacts with automated voter registration, especially with the provision in the bill for young people to register at age 14. I'd like your views on how we can make that work as effectively as possible in tandem, please.
Yes, I mean, I think we talk about who is not registered. It's young people, and so I think voter registration really should be integrated into the schools process. I think that's the most systematic way of doing that. So the difficulty there, the one tension point, is nationality. So at the moment, nationality data, at the moment there are specific nationalities that are eligible to vote for some elections, but not for others. The situation is simpler in Scotland and Wales, where it's residence-based voting, and there are very, very strong arguments for residence-based voting, I would add, for parliamentary and local elections as well. But the nationalities is the technical issue. So do schools have data on nationality? Should they ask pupils for data on their nationality? There's some arguments why they should. This would facilitate voter registration, other aspects which are important are relevant. But there have also been some concerns there as well, that schools might pick and choose pupils on the basis of nationality. That's the question and the tension point. But I think the only way to make vote to 16 work is to enable registration in schools.
I would also add that it's not necessary for the school to have nationality data if they have an assisted process, in a sense that they prompt and assist the pupils to access the existing online registration system, and then the children in question might then confirm or not confirm. And of course, all of those online registrations are then checked by the electoral registration officers, which means there is this additional check of which registers will the kids be eligible to be on ultimately. But I do agree this is such an important part of the reform, and to assuage the kind of conservative fears about treating other voters differently, I would say that...
I think it's partly political, what I said. But
assisted registration would therefore meet that kind of criterion of not necessarily automatically registering, but assisting that population, which is much easier to access, basically.
Just one quick point there. We actually do have automatic re-registration. That's not really acknowledged. That was a reform in the last Parliament. You have automatic re-registration. It's called Canvas reform, but basically data sources are used to automatically re-register people if they have not moved. The main beneficiary of that is obviously older populations who tend to be less mobile. So I think introducing this for young people is almost like for like in many senses.
Quick follow-up if I can. It strikes me that year 9 in the school year is the logical time to do this. I think that's before they start the GCSE syllabus, because most of those courses are 2 years, and that would then link with age 14. Please tell me if you've got a different view, but that seems like an opportunity. And then quickly, I am conscious of time, I am interested in your views on other barriers facing young people, because one thing I've encountered on the doorstep, and I suspect is true of colleagues, is I often meet young people who say, I don't feel like I know enough, and therefore I won't vote. And I find that less common amongst older voters. So there is another barrier there, a feeling that they shouldn't, when of course we need to make sure that they are very clear that they have just as much of a right to vote, and interested on any quick reflections on what other work we could do in that space.
Of course, the always tricky point of civic education in schools is one that would have to be discussed by the government, because this is an area that is always controversial. People always worry about how much kind of lead can the teachers give the children, etc. But there is a lot of research showing that earlier franchise actually enables those young people to take those kinds of steps in their own hands and inform themselves, knowing that they are eligible might spur a lot of them on, and especially if they are already registered as voters, that might be a good step for them to take steps to inform themselves and educate themselves too.
I think that's an absolutely vital point, and I'm a bit concerned that the government, in response to questions about this, has replied by saying that, well, we're introducing changes through the National Curriculum Review, which will not be implemented in time for the next election. So I think a clear focus on thinking through what needs to change in citizenship education in terms of the curriculum, but also in terms of supporting teachers to enable teachers to navigate this minefield of ensuring that they are impartial and seen to be impartial by all of their pupils and parents, is incredibly important in order to do this.
Thank you very much. I think you've given us some thoughts and some areas that we'll definitely continue to pursue in the course of this inquiry. Order.